Okay, everybody, we are going to do chapter 13, our blood vessels and circulation. So we talked about the blood itself in chapter 11 and what components it is made up of. In chapter 12, we talked about the heart, which is going to pump blood to our lungs and eventually out to our entire system. And so now we're going to talk about kind of the peripheral system that our blood pumps to and returns from to get back to the heart. So our blood vessels that lie outside of our heart are divided into two what they call classes. So we have pulmonary vessels, and so these are going to be the ones that are going to transport blood from the right ventricle of the heart through the lungs and back to the left atrium. So they're named accordingly. We have our pulmonary arteries that are going to carry blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. We have our pulmonary veins that are going to bring blood back to our left atrium. Our systemic vessels are going to transport blood from the left ventricle all the way through the body and back to the right atrium. And so that starts with the aorta in terms of where our left ventricle is going to pump into the aorta, that first artery. Then all of our other arteries are going to branch off of the aorta and carry blood away from the heart throughout the entire body. And then we have our veins that are going to bring blood back from everywhere. Eventually, they meet either upper or lower body into the superior or inferior vena cava, and that is what empties into our right atrium. So this picture gives a little bit of a summary of what we just said. Some of the other things we can point out, our liver or our hepatic circulation is another piece to this. Our digestive tract is a big part of our circulation, and our kidneys also have a big role in our circulation. Both our liver and kidneys work to kind of as a filter for our blood. So our blood vessel's primary function is to be the carrier or the highway for our blood. And down at the capillary level at the target tissue, that's where exchange of nutrients, waste products, and gases is going to occur. Because we're carrying blood, we're transporting a lot of substances. We can regulate blood pressure. This is primarily done by change in size or diameter of our arteries. And we can also change the diameter of our arteries to either increase or decrease blood flow to certain tissues. So our blood vessels have three different layers known as tunics. So we have the tunica intima. This is going to be our innermost layer, and it is simple squamous, so just one layer of flat, thin cells. Our tunica media is our middle layer, and this is our muscle layer. So it contains smooth muscle and then some elastin and collagen to provide some strength, and the elastin allows it to change shape more easily. The tunica adventitia, that's going to be our outermost layer, and that's primarily just going to be kind of dense connective and loose connective tissue that provides a kind of covering and protective layer for our vessels. So remember, the kind of rule of thumb is arteries always carry away. So they're going to carry blood away from the heart. They're quite thick compared to our veins, and they have a lot of elastic tissue. So when we were talking about our functions a second ago, I said both blood pressure regulation and the ability to direct the amount of blood flow to certain tissues is typically controlled by the change in size of our arteries. So we need a lot of elastic tissue, and it of course has all three layers since it's our thickest vessels. Our veins carry blood back towards the heart. You can see just by the picture, they are much thinner. They do still have all three tunics, but the middle layer, that muscle layer especially, is much thinner in a vein than it is in our arteries. And one unique feature of veins is these valves. So our arteries have our heart as the pump behind them. They're under a lot of pressure that's kind of directing the blood to continue to flow. Our veins don't have that same pressure that are helping them get blood back to the heart. So we're fighting gravity for one, especially in our lower bodies, is going to pull blood the opposite direction. and we don't have a pump to push it back. So we have these valves so that as blood flows back towards the heart, they will open to allow blood in, and then they'll close to make sure that that blood continues to flow in the right direction. So just like the valves in our heart, the valve's job is to ensure that blood is going to flow in the proper direction. Okay, like I said, our capillaries is going to be where we actually have exchange between the blood and our tissues. So our capillaries really only have the inner layer, that tunica intima. And if you think of our capillaries' job, that makes sense. So remember, form always follows function. So having that one thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, that is going to allow it to easily exchange nutrients, gases, and all that stuff that's happening in our capillary beds. So you'll see as our arteries get smaller, we call them arterioles. And so this is going to be right at the tissue level in our bodies. So we have the arterial side of our capillary bed or network, and then we have the venule side of our capillary network or bed. On the arterial side, you see these precapillary sphincters, and so they can kind of open or close. So if they're all open, we're going to get a lot of blood flow there. If we close some of them, then we're not going to get as much blood flow to that tissue. And so on the artery side, we're going to drop off things like oxygen and glucose to the tissues. And then our veins are going to pick up wastes like carbon dioxide and bring them back to the heart. And then you'll see in our next chapter, there's actually a third color. There's some green capillaries that are our lymphatic system's capillaries that kind of clean up some of the extra stuff, but we'll save that for next chapter. This slide just shows a good summary of the differences between our arteries and our veins, as well as the capillary down at the bottom. Okay, so earlier on, we said our pulmonary circulation is when we're going from the right ventricle to the lungs and back to the left atrium of the heart. So it's just the part of our circulation that is responsible for oxygenating our blood. So our pulmonary trunk is what carries blood from the right ventricle prior to reaching the pulmonary arteries. So that's going towards the lung. And then veins always flow back to the heart. So our pulmonary veins are going to bring blood from the lungs that now are rich in oxygen to our left atrium, so that our left side of our heart is now ready to pump that oxygenated blood to the body. So the systemic circulation goes from the left ventricle, and that, remember, pumps blood through our aorta and throughout the entire body. And then our veins are going to bring it back to the right atrium. So oxygenated blood from those pulmonary veins is where we got that blood from the first place. So that's the end of the pulmonary circulation as we enter our left atrium. And then as that blood enters the left ventricle and is pumped out, that's going to become the systemic circulation. All right, I don't necessarily need you to memorize every single major artery. There will be some that show up here as we go through. So you don't need to know every single one of these, but they are named for their region, so they're not too hard to follow along with. So we're going to start with the aorta. So the ascending aorta is going to be kind of the very first part. It goes superiorly straight up from the left ventricle. So that's a pretty small section of the aorta. And then you see our aorta kind of arches. And so that's the aortic arch. We have three major arteries that are going to stem off of our aortic arch. We'll look at those actually when we get a little bit more zoomed in. And then our descending aorta, that's going to be the rest all the way down through our thoracic cavity and into our abdomen. It splits kind of just below our belly button, and that's how it splits to go down the legs in our iliac arteries. So as I said, this is the kind of two divisions of the descending aorta. So the thoracic portion, so that's just like our thoracic cavity, kind of thorax to diaphragm, and then abdominal is going to be below the diaphragm. And then, as I said, we divide to become the common iliac arteries, and those are going to branch into both legs. So these ones highlighted here, you should definitely know. Brachiocephalic is one of the ones that comes directly off of the aorta. We have our common carotid that is eventually going to split into our internal and external carotid arteries. And that is what is going to supply a majority of the head, face, and brain. So that's why these are very important in our head and neck. You can find your carotid pulse pretty easily if you go kind of just below your jawline over on either the right or left side of your neck, and you should be able to get a pulse if you dig a couple fingers in. So just keep an eye on these ones that are highlighted in yellow. Those are the only ones that you should be concerned about. So axillary, named for the axillary region in the armpit. Brachial runs just between your biceps and triceps. That's the artery that you would take a pulse at on an infant or a young child. Your radial artery is on your thumb side. Pretty easy to find the pulse there too. And then you have an ulnar artery on your pinky side. So one kind of fun fact to point out is anywhere that you can find a pulse is going to be an artery. We don't take pulses at veins because remember, our veins don't have the pump or the engine behind them. That's our arteries. So the pulses you feel is each time our heart beats, you can feel that pulsatile kind of flow of blood through that particular section. Your femoral artery is a very large artery, big time problems if that is injured because of the amount of blood passing through there. The popliteal artery, you can sometimes feel very faintly in the back portion of your knee, in that soft spot behind the knee. The anterior and posterior tibial artery are going to go down the front and back of the shin area. Your fibular artery passes just with your fibula on the lateral portion of your lower leg. And then the dorsalis pedis is just distal to your ankle, kind of on the top of your foot. And that's one they'll check if they're worried about blood flow not getting all the way to your toes. So for some people, especially those with diabetes or other issues with blood flow, the dorsalis pedis is what they will check to make sure that they're actually getting adequate flow. So a lot of the veins and arteries share the same name, not all of them, but a lot of them. So big key to remember is that our veins are going to be in charge of returning blood to the heart. In our systemic circulation, that blood is going to be deoxygenated. Think all of our tissues just used up the oxygen and nutrients. So what they're sending back is deoxygenated. Remember, in our pulmonary circulation, this is kind of the exception to the rule. Blood is still returning to the heart, so we know it's in veins, but our pulmonary veins have oxygenated blood rather than deoxygenated blood. So our superior and inferior vena cava, you've heard those plenty of times now if you've listened to chapter 12 in our pathway through the heart. So superior is going to be upper body, so that's head, neck, our thorax or chest, and our right upper limb. Then our inferior vena cava gets the abdomen, pelvis, both lower limbs. And both of these are going to empty into the right atrium. The jugular vein, both internal and external, is kind of the main vein that our head and neck and brain are going to drain into eventually. Again, we have our axillary and brachial, and then a median cubital vein rather than our radial one. So this is kind of dead center right at where the soft spot of the elbow is on the front, and that's oftentimes the area they'll look for if they're going to draw blood. In the actual thorax or chest, the brachiocephalic vein on the right and left side is what merge to form our superior vena cava. And then we have our inferior vena cava here. It's getting blood all the way from the lower body, but that's also going to get the blood from the liver or hepatic portal circulation and the kidney or renal veins. In the lower limbs, our femoral, popliteal, those we already saw. You have posterior and anterior tibial again. You have a fibular vein, and then a couple that we haven't seen, or one is the great saphenous vein. And that is the longest vein in the body. You can see it travels all the way down the inside from the upper to lower leg. If you've ever heard of someone getting a heart bypass, if they had more than one uh, bypass done, which is very common, likely they have a portion of their great saphenous vein that is now functioning as a coronary artery for the heart. That's the vein that they usually harvest when they're going to do a heart bypass. And that's actually kind of what my wife specializes in as a physician assistant, is cardiothoracic surgery. So that is a surgery that she does probably once a week. All right. We know a lot of us are familiar with blood pressure or the concept of blood pressure, and that's something that we measure. But what it actually is the force or pressure that our blood is exerting against our blood vessel wall. And so systolic over diastolic is how we present it. So this would be 120 millimeters of mercury is our unit. So 120 millimeters of mercury systolic pressure over 80 millimeters of mercury diastolic pressure. Remember, systole is a contraction. So systolic pressure is going to be that pressure when the heart is beating, and diastolic pressure is when the heart is relaxed. So it makes sense that our systolic number is higher than our diastolic number. Average blood pressure, and what they used to say was kind of normal, is 120 over 80. In a lot of the literature now, even American Heart Association, which is kind of the gold standard, you'll see that average blood pressure or normal they want at 110 over 70 now. And that's partly because high blood pressure is such an epidemic in the country that they kind of bring the bar lower or make it tougher to have normal blood pressure. That way they can treat more people early for what they consider kind of pre-hypertension before blood pressure gets really bad. And that is chapter 13. So we will finish up chapter 14, the lymphatic system, for the last lecture of unit 4. And so that one is a little bit of an outlier, but you'll see it ties in with our previous chapters as well. Have a great day.